Hello and welcome. My name is Enrico E. Manalo. I'm the Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc. And today I am joined with my very special guest and close friend, John Monaghan III, who is more than our Director of Partnerships. He holds a master's degree in organizational development, was formerly the Chief of Police for Moulton Borough and Franconia, New Hampshire, trained as a martial artist and Eastern medicine practitioner, and even built furniture. So we also nerd out about talking like OD theories or organizational and development theories, frameworks, and ideas in our drive to advance racial equity. Another way to put that might be that John is not only a leader on our team, he's a thought leader on our team. And I am so pleased to have him here with us today as we talk about what All Aces sees as core equity opportunities, which are knowledge, communication, and relationships. So, John, how are you? For real, for real.
I'm pretty good, Rico. It's good to see you again. And hello, everyone that's out there. Nice to see you all too. Rico and I actually do this every week, but just by ourselves. We geek out together over concepts and theories and how you put them into practice. And so, really excited to be here and have a little bit of our alone time shared with everyone out there. So. I'm pretty happy about it. It's one of my favorite things that we do, and it's exciting to do it with everyone else watching.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be able to bring this to the masses, so to speak. Well, we'll see if they can handle it. So, boilerplate question. And as I've kind of outlined, John, you do a lot of different things. So, very broadly, what made you fall in love with what you do?
Yeah, and I remember reading the question. I'm like, I don't know if I fell in love with what I did, but I felt like I did it out of necessity in some ways. I mean,
Mm,
it's interesting because you talked about some of my history. You know, I was a martial artist and then studied traditional Chinese medicine because one of my teacher's teacher who I trained with in Arizona was expressing that really important need to balance your martial skill with your healing skills.
yeah.
Um, and that was interesting for me to do. And I brought that same sort of practice into policing with me. The sort of the I don't know the skills of a warrior with the heart of a healer, for
Yeah.
looking at harm that was being done and how it could show up and maybe make it better. And so anyways, I'm so at the end of my career, did a lot of work with criminal justice reform. And so was thrilled to be able to bring organizational development work into racial equity work and do our work here at All Aces. So, yeah.
Yeah, what you were talking about also kind of, so I know in some Eastern cultures, that is kind of the concept, heart of the warrior and the healer together. In the West, we often talk about that slightly differently in the context of the warrior poet, right?
Mm.
And well, having a background in poetry myself, I can see the connection there between healing and writing, being able to express yourself intellectually as well as physically. And that really kind of, for me, gets to interconnectedness, which we
Mm.
talk a lot about in the context of racial equity. But many years ago, I remember reading something, and the argument was that the universe is a single object, right? So I was kind of learning more about the idea of multiple universes and things. And if the universe is like a closed system, if it's a single object, then that implies that everything that exists within it is also interconnected, and that's supported by the idea that gravity pulls on everything. And as a component of that immense object, it's very easy to lose sight of that. And in racial equity, it's very easy to lose sight of that as well. And certainly, it's crucial to conflict resolution. That's often how we generate solutions and figure out options and how to think outside of the box. The box, of course, being something that we've all kind of constructed for ourselves.
Mm.
So, speaking of boxes that we've constructed for ourselves, I know that when I started my own racial equity journey, one, I didn't even know that I was on it, but part of it was trying to fit myself into the box that I saw presented to me, right? So a male child who is an American does these things, right? So I remember that my barber in Dover, New Hampshire, an ancient Greek man named George, he would always ask me if I'd been playing baseball. Oh, always ask me if I'd been playing a lot of baseball. And as a child of the '90s, I was kind of like, where am I gonna run into a group of kids playing a baseball game in southern New Hampshire, man? Like it's just not going to happen. But nonetheless, it did feel like that was something that I was supposed to be doing, even if that was a very outdated framing. So I'm curious, John, thinking back on your own racial equity journey, like how is it that you went from doing all of those things and into doing what we do now?
Yeah.
And what are some of the surprising things that you've learned about yourself along the way?
Yeah. So I think, like a lot of white people, especially growing up in suburban Massachusetts, where I did, you don't necessarily have to be aware of racial issues or racial equity issues, especially because they don't necessarily pertain to your life, unless you're touched in a unique way. As a police chief, what happened is that the internet got good enough and cell phone coverage got good enough that I and most of the nation started seeing things that we had not seen before. If you're able to sort of tuck away into your raised ranch, and just watch whatever the TV feeds you, you didn't see a lot of the racial injustice that still occurs today, and it disturbed me greatly. I didn't like it. And when I started looking into it, I heard terms like white privilege and things that don't really settle well on my white ears, So but I've never been one to shy away from confrontation or discomfort. So I was like, well, I'm going to learn about this, So I started really looking at, what does that mean? And I remember reading an article, and I forget the author. I wish I could quote him. He deserves the credit, but he talked about trying to explain why Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter is a term, and because I was trying to wrap my head around it, because I was like, well, all lives do matter, and so this article basically said, we've got all these bones in our bodies, and if one is broken, that bone is really, really important to get fixed, and if you go to the doctor and you're like, I broke my femur or my humerus, I'm pointing to my humerus, I broke my arm, actually it's here. So
that was your humorous aside. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. If he's like, well, all your bones matter, that doesn't settle real well when, it's your humerus that needs to so,
Yeah.
so then I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? And so I started really digging into racial equity work. And fortunately for me, I went through a cohort of called an affinity group through University of New Hampshire at the Scarcity School.
Oh, yeah.
And we had Michelle and Andreas on before on our
Yeah, you hosted them.
Yeah, and it was what's called learning for equity for leaders, and it's called L2E2, and it's about learning about racial issues, but white people learning for themselves. Because what happened is they surveyed a lot of the Black leaders in New Hampshire, and they were like, listen, we want to work with our communities, but we don't want to shoulder the work. Like, and this often is what we see in organizations, right? Where people will be like, well, Jim's African American or Black, and so he must be an expert in racial equity. So we'll just ask him all about this. We'll give him the DEI efforts. We'll do all that, and it's really an unfair ask, because Jim is an expert in his life and in the things he's experienced, but not necessarily in racial equity work or social injustice or any form of oppression, right? So this learning experience was for white people specifically to start to learn about these things, and so I did, and I was able to see how it intersected with criminal justice and start to do that work, and it was fascinating for me. When I was able to retire, I had met Dr. Martin at a conference, and I really wanted to do this work full time. And so I was fortunate to come here, work with you, which has been a true blessing for me, because in addition to doing racial equity work that we do, we get to work with one another. And, we joke about one of our benefits in our benefit package is, that I get to spend time with you. And I really appreciate your intellect, your curiosity, and your your sense of humor, really.
Well,
That's what
thank
I like.
you. Yeah. Yeah. So this is our EVP, our employee value proposition in action, I guess. Yeah. So that's really interesting, especially kind of, well, many people are kind of familiar with Massachusetts, but maybe not New England as a whole.
Mm,
So there's this idea that it's very white, but certainly being from New Hampshire is something that I was keenly aware of because I'm the child of professors. And, many of my friends growing up in Durham, New Hampshire, same boat, but the towns just next door, so Lee, New Hampshire, very working class at the time. And you could visibly see that there were the kids of professors, white collar workers, and kids of more working class people.
mm,
And so there are a lot of disparities within that very white population of New Hampshire. And so, I know that some people will bristle against this, but it kind of gets to that idea that, yes, there is diversity within whiteness. And if we are not addressing diversity within whiteness, then that is yet another way that many white people feel like diversity is code for other people's problems.
mm,
And yeah, your point about the internet is very well taken because I do recall growing up that, uh, a lot of the things that I would learn in my social studies classes about, the civil rights movement, that all felt very far away, and not only in terms of time, but the places that were mentioned. Right, I'd never been there. I had no context for understanding why that situation had developed, or why we were paying so much attention to it. And certainly we see this line of argument kind of come through today, but at the time I was noticing that there were a lot of problems in New Hampshire. Right, there are some very rich people, and there are a lot of not rich people.
yeah.
And so this is part of that whole dynamic of why so many people work in, say, Boston or Massachusetts in general. So yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like, what do I want to say here? Sometimes, well, often, in discussions of racial equity, we look outward but not inward, and that is something that I have found very valuable about working at All Aces. Is it really kind of seeks to connect the dots between what's going on inside of us and the kind of organizations that we are building and the racism that exists there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had, if anything in what I was just saying kind of connected for you, but kind of curious to get more of your perspective.
Yeah. I think, it's so one of the things that put me most at ease when I met Dr. Martin, because all she knew is I was a police chief, and I was like, man, here this woman owns a racial equity firm, and I'm a cop, right? Like that's the setup for our introduction, and and so she, as I bumbled, and stumbled and all over myself trying to explain that I wasn't that guy, she said, racism is harmful to white people too, but in different ways, and I didn't get it, at first. And it's actually because working at All Aces that I've really come to understand that racism and other forms of oppression do affect us all. They affect us differently in different ways and disproportionately, but they're harmful. Systems of oppression, systemic racism is harmful. And the piece that is difficult, and I think that this is what we run into in the work that we do, is that everybody wants to stand up against that, and many of us think of it as, well, I carry my protest sign, and I will denounce any form of bigotry that I see. And then there's this internal piece that you're speaking about, right? Like, how am I possibly participating in a system that is harmful to others? And that takes some introspective work, and that is hard to do because sometimes it's a little bit ugly in there, right? And so
Yeah.
so realizing, like, oh my gosh, like I participated in this system that hurt other people, and I didn't even know it. And that's the
Yeah.
worst part. And as that you kind of wake up to that, there's like this process you go through, hopefully, where you kind of go through like this awakening, like, oh my gosh, and then like maybe some guilt, maybe some shame, and then enough learning about yourself and how those things work that you're like, okay, well, now I can do something about Like
Yeah.
I think I've got a position to play here, and I think I've got some tools to play it with, and that I've got a voice and some actions that I can take now that I understand myself, now that I understand these systems and how I can actively work to, dismantle them or disrupt them from harming other people. And in the process, make them better for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true because as you were talking, the image of somebody attending a BLM protest or a meeting, and then taking the train home, and also clutching their bag or their purse, that's real.
Mhm.
And I feel like that is a common enough experience for people. And I'm not 100% sure if people are aware of when it's happening, but I do know that the subconscious works all the time. And, a lot of people that I've come into contact with have very strong but undefined feelings around the role that they themselves play in racism, right? And it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And a lot of times, part of that discomfort is not knowing where to begin. So we run into a lot of people who they come to us with, we don't know what the right things are to say.
Mm,
And then we have to connect those dots, right? So it's not all about what you're saying, right? Context matters, tone matters. And, this is not to dismiss intent versus impact at
right.
all. But this is not about creating traps for people to fall into so that they can be canceled, so that they can be crucified or, destroyed for, the mob's satisfaction. The mob
Sure.
being just like general humanity, not the mafia. I don't know what their stance is on racism, but I'm very curious to find out actually. So no, I won't issue that invitation. But anyway, if we're getting back to where we can begin, yeah,
Yeah.
language is a nice place,
Right.
but the core equity opportunities that Dr. Martin's research and work has really identified are communication, knowledge, and relationships. So communication, having been a teacher of language for a long time, it's not just about the grammar, it's not just about the accent, the construction, or anything like that. It's that sum total of signals that you're putting out there and your capacity to receive and to interpret and decode the many signals that come at us.
Mm.
So if we're kind of thinking about that communication piece, right? Like what are some skills for communication that advance racial equity that a lot of times people have not spent much time developing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been fortunate. You've introduced me and many of our teammates to, professors from university who or have doctorate degrees in communication and dialogue, and so that's been a real gift. And in practice, you and I, we do a ton of workshops together. We co-facilitate a lot. And you're right. Many people show up like, well, just teach me the right words so I don't say the wrong thing. It's a lot of fear around that. And there is a piece of having enough context to have language to be able to speak about it. But like you said, it's really about how you show up and how you're able to set a container. And so that's, I think, what we really try to do is how do we create a container for learning? Because everybody's on a spectrum, right? We just talked about, like, you and I started out somewhere, and I'm sure we said a lot of the wrong things along the way, but our hearts and our minds and our intentions were headed in the right direction. So how do you create a space that's safe for people to come into, to discover themselves, to discover these issues, to work around them together? And really what it comes down to is how are we building our community larger and larger and larger? And that gets to your point about calling people in versus calling them out, or canceling them, because we will make mistakes. We'll say the wrong thing, we'll mess up along the way. And if we have a good enough community to embrace one another in those moments and to help each other learn that interconnected piece, that's what we're really aiming for, because the greater our community can grow, the greater impact we can have. And so, communication is a big part of that, because how we talk to one another, and how that will affect how we're able to grow our relationships, and so on. Well, I don't want to give it all away.
Yeah. No, to your point, like that, I think that community piece is really important, right? So maybe some of us out there are kind of getting tired of hearing things like, "Oh, it's so nice to be in community with you," but it's easy to brush off if that's just kind of like the thing you're supposed to say.
Right.
But if we stay at that level of the right things and the wrong things, then really the language connected to social and racial justice, advancing racial equity, if we stay at that level, then it becomes a really a tool for denying the full humanity of people who don't know how to speak in that manner.
Mm.
Right. And something that many people have said to me is, one thing that I really don't like about this whole social and racial justice thing is there's so many terms that get thrown out. And when I don't know the right thing to say, then people just code me as a bad person.
Yeah.
And that's so true. Like, that's not a way to build a relationship. I mean, well, you are building a relationship, but it's a very negative one.
Yeah.
It's that I don't like you and you don't belong. So
Right.
why would somebody feeling like that support you in your
Right.
presumably earnest efforts to do something for the good of everyone
Yeah.
if you start off by harming somebody, basically?
What? Right. Well, you're not included in my diversity, equity, and inclusion, so
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a little contradictory. I mean, there are people that are harmful out there. There's a lot of people. I think, one thing that we work on, in addition to helping people with their communication skills, is really developing their emotional intelligence, their ability, and you do this a lot, is their ability to manage conflict with one another, which I've come to really understand is just, you're negotiating belief systems and life experiences so that you can have a greater understanding of how this world might be different for someone else. When you're able to, really harness those skills in yourself with another person, you can overcome obstacles. And you and I have talked about people having goals that are similar, as
Yeah.
different as my beliefs or experiences might be. I care about my kids as much as you care about your kids, and I love my dog as much as you love your dog. And we want a safe city to live in. How we get there might be different. We might have differing ideas. But if we're just canceling one another out because you're not saying the things I want to hear, I'm missing out on an opportunity to be in a relationship with you and learn from you, even if it's a different perspective that might challenge my own. And I'm missing the opportunity to perhaps share with you, if you're receptive, things that might enhance the way that you see the world. And eventually, because it's a process, and I think people forget that it's not a one and done, that
Yeah.
this is, people evolve. Like, if you talk to someone last year versus this year versus next year, they're going to be very different people. And so understanding that, and giving people a little bit of grace and space to move, will allow them to grow, but if we're boxing, back to your box, right? If we're boxing people in, regardless of what kind of box we're making, it doesn't give them a lot of room to move.
Yeah, and there's again that dehumanization piece, right? So to connect the dots here, racism is a form of dehumanizing people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but it's not the only way, right? We dehumanize one another all the time, all the time. One of the examples that is really salient for me is how Americans culturally, how we talk to each other, right? So we meet one another in a COVID safe place or a COVID cautious place, and we're kind of networking, whatever, and oh, hey, what do you do for a living? Why is that the most important thing? Not
Right.
who are you as a person, who are you as a human being.
Hmm.
How do you generate capital for other people, John? Like, that's like what?
And now I think actually, in is it ni hao in Chinese, and it means have you eaten today? That's it's different cultures greet each other in different ways. Like, are you hungry? Like, because if you're hungry, let's go get that taken care of before we continue with our relationship. Like,
Yeah.
uh, And if I misquoted, please, people who understand Chinese, correct me. But but that's what my kung fu teacher told me. So,
Okay.
yeah. But I think you're right. We like, hey, what do you? My name's John. What do you do for a living? Well, I wrangle cattle. Like it's this sort of Wild West, attitude rather than, who are you? Who are you? And I'm not sure that people even know how to answer that question because it doesn't get asked enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I am a conflict management expert and a racial equity practitioner, but that's what I do. That's not who I am, right? And so it's really by developing that who I am piece that really affects what it is we do and how we do it. And that's kind of the point, right? And I think this becomes especially salient in organizational life, right? So once we got our workflows, our processes, that's a lot of energy and a lot of motion. It's often too much for any one person to just put the brakes on. So if we can't stop the machine to kind of take it apart and adjust things, then it's just going to keep producing the same old thing that it always has, which is in effect what we're pushing against. Although the route there might not be so straightforward as we would like. But in addition to communication being really important, right? So this helps us to, when we come from many different backgrounds, to establish common norms and social mores, things like that. But those relationships, right? So we're communicating. We have to be communicating with somebody, and you mentioned extending grace to one another, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's somebody who I'm never ever going to see again, I'm relatively certain, then it might not be like my internal calculus might arrive at the conclusion, well, it's not worth it for me to extend that person grace
Yeah.
because this is a one and done.
Right.
And there's no judgment there. We make this decision all the time, right? Like I would probably be far more considerate of you, John, than I would of the person who I passed on the street last Tuesday, who I will never see again.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's something that we don't often think about, but these are choices that we're making. And so when it comes down to building relationships, right? Again, kind of what we're getting at here is we have to form a relationship with ourselves. But with your background and from what we've been learning about ourselves on this racial equity journey, I'm kind of curious about your current thoughts on what goes into building good relationships at work or outside of it.
Yeah. Interesting you say that. So I'm like not the best. I'm I've always been like really kind of a lone wolf in many ways. So like I'm not like the best at relationships, full disclosure, everyone. But like I mean I love my wife and she loves me, so that's good. But like I'm not the guy with like 30 friends that are like John's here. So but I do have a small circle of friends who I have deep and meaningful relationships with. Um, so I think it's different for everyone, and so, but for me, I'll speak from my own experience that, my relationships are built on trust. They're built on, and trust comes from reliability, and it comes from competence, and it comes from, knowing that I can count on someone, knowing that my secrets are safe with them, so to speak. They're smart, they know what they're doing, and I can count on them. So and over time, as that gets reinforced, your relationships really strengthen with people, and that's personal relationships, and it's also work relationships too, so you're a great co-facilitator for me. We work well together. I know that when I'm in a death spiral, in a workshop because somebody asked me a question I don't know the answer to, and I don't have 20 minutes to go Google it, I can like just pass the ball over to you, and I know that about you because I know we've worked together enough, and I know how smart you are and how reliable you are and how good you are on your feet. That I can count on you in those moments, and that gives me great comfort. And I think things like that, I mean, and that's speaking nothing about racial equity, right? But that just builds a good relationship between you and I, a
Yeah.
relationship built on trust, on caring, on knowing what you're made of and who you are. And and then when we go do racial equity work, right, like that bond is like the machine that allows us to deliver, what it is that we're delivering, and
Yeah.
for us, it's racial equity.
Thank you so much for all those kind words, and I definitely feel the same. And just to share out with everybody, like when I'm kind of stuck on a train of thought, right? So when I'm reevaluating how I'm thinking about something, John is often the first person that I will go to, right? Because there is that trust there. And I think that this is something that a lot of people have not had the opportunity to do, right? And this gets at kind of the concept of collective care that we talk about so much in the course of our work with All Aces. But if you don't have a space where you can pull your own head apart and examine it, and somebody who you're with a lot and who you built up this good relationship, and you can ask, like, John, am I getting messed up over nothing, or what's up? Like, yeah, sometimes you can go into that death spiral type thing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't feel good, right? Because there, I think for so many people out there, they grapple with these things that they maybe don't have language for, they maybe don't have context for, they don't know who they can go to ask about it.
Mhm.
And so it becomes a sense of deficit, a sense
Mhm.
of incompleteness, of shame.
Yeah.
And that's just super not healthy. And we see this expressed in organizational dynamics all the time, right? So when teams and groups and whole organizations are dysfunctional or even toxic, it's often because the communication and relationships aren't quite connecting. And yeah, people don't know what to do about that, in part because culturally we are trained to be conflict averse, right? So anger might be a reason to call the police, for example, right? It might be you might feel that's the only kind of outlet that you have, particularly if you're a man, because you
Mhm.
might have grown up thinking like the only emotion that I can have is anger. That's
Right.
the only legitimate one.
Right. Yeah, that's tough. Well, we've been taught to be independent, right? To be competitive. And oftentimes our workplaces reinforce that, where when you want a promotion, you want attention, you want a pay raise, your work's got to be better than someone else's. And people will use the word like teamwork, and we're a team, and then yet your evaluations and your promotions and your pay raises all depend on you beating the other person.
Yeah.
And in doing so, and we learn a lot of our competitiveness through sports. We're indoctrinated into it, and like you said, as men especially, we tend to we're expected to limit our emotions. And so one of the very few emotions we can express without, someone making fun of you as a young man is anger.
Mhm.
They think that's okay. And with all the stressors that people put on us to become what society expects us to be, like a breadwinner, and have a good job, and to do all these things, if that's unavailable to us, violence is often an easy replacement for it. And so we'll see
Yeah.
violent action oftentimes because people feel inadequate in other places. And so and this, I think, really gets well into your conflict management. And you say this a lot, that if there's not a healthy outlet for conflict, right? Like if in that rugged competitiveness and in that pitting one against another in teamwork at a organization, there's not a healthy way to resolve that tension, it's going to come out in some really dysfunctional ways.
Yeah.
And we talk about those are fertile breeding grounds for sexism and racism and all the other ways that we can dehumanize one another, because we have created a playing field that doesn't value interdependence and respecting one another's humanity, and that instead of me crossing the finish line, we cross the finish line. And you said it the other day before one of our workshops, to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. And so
Mm.
so it's really about reevaluating what are we collectively all about.
Yeah, and so I guess I've got a question for you about that. So you've got this great background in organizational development. You've got this perspective from practicing Eastern medicines and those healing kind of arts. You also have a knowledge of how to put things together. Not just from your time building furniture, but you've worked in many different organizations. And so I guess I'm wondering, right? So the other day you said to me, how do we know that we are tending to how do we know that we're not tending to our weeds and not our flowers? So like how do we know that we're directing our attention in the best ways to create that organization? And I think at the heart of that is transitioning from I to we. So like
Mhm.
a single cell to a whole body, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty profound, and I'm surprised that I said that. But thank
I wrote it down.
I was like, wow, I was in rare form that day. So thank you for that, Rico, and for our audience. Thank you for being here. So yeah, there's another saying similar to it, and it's like I think I forget what it is, but it's like we've got two wolves inside of ourselves. One's good, one's bad, and
Mm,
they're like, well, which one grows? The one that you feed, right? So it's a similar idea. Like, what are you fertilizing and what are you plucking? In organizations. So, and it's what do you value, and how are we measuring, rewarding, and how do those things show up in our organization? So I did a lot of character based hiring. Like, so what do we stand for? What are our values as an organization? How do we create a hiring process that brings those, first attracts those people, and then weeds the ones that aren't part of that out, so that we get the people who are based on our values? Then how do we create evaluation systems that measure who's doing the best at those things? And a lot of that is qualitative versus quantitative. Like, just because you have the most widgets doesn't mean you're living the values of the organization. And then how do you create promotional processes where people who are really living into those values get to grow in the company, and then also help foster that company culture of interdependence, of caring for one another?
yeah. And so just to clarify, what we're talking about here is really value alignment and not, say, culture fit, which I think it exists along the same spectrum, but usually culture fit is kind of it's more of a screening process, right? Rather than trying to figure out what works, right?
Yeah,
So it's like, okay, so do you belong or not? And often that's coming from a place that is very much steeped in white supremacy culture, right?
exactly.
So they're kind of trying to see if you can assimilate, right? Your assimilation potential.
Yep.
And the thing about assimilation, I know that we talk about assimilation and integration a lot, and people kind of it's easy to get confused. But if you're assimilating, then you are giving up parts of yourself, and not usually by choice, so that you can become a certain thing to fit yourself into the box again.
Right.
Whereas value alignment is more like, hey, this is who I want to be. This is who you as an organization say you want to be. Is this a match, or are we going our separate ways? And sometimes that does take a little while to figure out. I mean, I feel like there's also a distinction to be made between dysfunction and toxicity, right?
Hmm.
So if we're going back to that analogy of the body, that broken bone, that is a dysfunction. That doesn't mean that you chop off the arm, right? Because then you will not have an arm. Uh, what it does mean is if there are dysfunctions, these are things that we need to be paying attention to,
Hmm.
right? It's when things become toxic that it goes from an injury to, say, if we're sticking with this analogy, something like gangrene, something that is too far gone to be rescued, right? And I think we're kind of, in the name of efficiency, we're often quick to get there. Oh, fire this person, get rid of this project, whatever. And there are very real market forces that are at play. We can't deny that. But that label of toxicity has been applied very liberally and very quickly to many things, not without reason, but still, that's the speed in which people code things that is often worrying. Um, so I wonder if we can kind of pivot to knowledge, which kind of helps us to determine whether or not something is simply dysfunctional or if it's toxic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also helps us to make decisions around things like value alignment.
Right. Yeah, I think as you were speaking, so I'm going to sound smarter than I am, and everything that I'm about to say I learned from Rico. So I'm just really good at applying things. So that's my talent set. But the difference between toxic and dysfunctional, great delineation, important to look into. So I'm going to link it back to conflict management. You're in an organization, there is something that needs to be resolved, right? And there is and we're unable to do it effectively, so we come up with dysfunctional ways to deal with it, right? Like, I can't get this resource that I need in the way that they're telling me to. They say submit this form and I can't do it, but if I know Steve will get it for me. So, like, it's not the way we're supposed to do it, but it's the way that gets it done, and it's dysfunctional, but it's work. So it's not functioning properly, right? It is dysfunctional. Versus there's a conflict that I can't resolve, and I've come up with this way to deal with it that's harmful to others, right? So I can't get this form. I'm mad at this person, and I'm going to do something using my, with Steve, in order to be harmful, so that something, and then we create, then you have rumors and you have gossip and you have people, undermining one another, and that's a really toxic work environment. What's interesting about what you said is, oftentimes, instead of looking at those dynamics, like why did these things come about, we're just like, well, let's just fire that guy. Right? Let's just fire him. And sure, if it's toxic, maybe you do need to fire the gangrene employee, right? Maybe. Or do we need to look a little deeper at root causes? Because when people start saying, I'm trying to work in this dysfunctional organization, and people are getting fired, but I can't quite figure out why, because things are confusing, and then it bleeds into organizational silence, right? Like, I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not going to do anything because I thought I was doing it right in the system that worked, and somebody just get fired. So now I'm just going to retract myself a little bit, and not show up as my full self. So I think, you can see how those two things happen. And in dysfunctional organizations, there tends to be, we talked about racism, sexism, there's bullying, that show. And so there's this whole, like, the culture that we're supposed to be versus the culture that has now come to life.
Mm-hmm.
You need to assimilate to this. You need to snap parts of yourself off, leave parts of yourself in the parking lot if you're going to be like us. Otherwise, you're on the outs, and you want to be on the in team, right? So yeah, there's toxicity, and then there's just dysfunction, which is we can't figure out what's broken, versus, like, I might get hurt if I don't do what's broken.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, if you drive, then I think you probably had the experience, and of course, I'm talking to the general you, not you, John. I know that you drive. You've driven me several places, but the check engine light comes on. In fact, this happened to me the other day. So a little wrench icon popped up and wouldn't go away. I tried resetting the light, all this kind of stuff. It turns out the car is telling me that I need my tires rotated. And it's telling me that I was supposed to rotate them about 40 miles ago. I don't have the time to do that right now. So I'm driving around with that check engine light on. Right. So I don't know when it's going to be a problem. I don't know how urgent it is. I don't know any of that stuff because I don't work on cars. But I do know that it's working well enough that I can keep going, but I may break down at any time. And I got to tell you, that's not my favorite way to drive around, especially with all the highway driving I got to do. And I'm just kind of reflecting on other work experiences that I've had. There have been many times where I've been aware that there is something is wrong, but perhaps I was not in a position to necessarily do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that kind of feeling of helplessness, I noticed that it really kind of expressed itself in other ways because I didn't have that healthy outlet as we were talking about. So maybe I would just take my sweet time because I was an hourly employee, right?
Hmm.
Or, yeah, to your point about organizational silence. I know that something's not working, but that's above my pay grade. So thanks for the money. Bye.
Hmm.
And so this kind of leads me back to that theme of dehumanization, right? So if we're really reducing one another to what we do for a living as what is valuable, then it's very easy to see that employees who are unhappy, they very quickly get to that this is not my job description thing. And it's when you start hearing people say that, you know, more than just isolated cases that I think it's pretty obvious that there's a problem. But a lot of our education as far as how we should be at work, it comes from school, which is very much about do what you're told,
Hmm.
get the good grade, go home, and then do the next thing.
Yeah.
And for me, that really just leads to despair. I don't see myself as a being descended from a long line of other beings evolving for millions of years to do what? To be unhappy for most of my day and generate money and resources for others. Like that just straight up makes no sense.
Right. Yeah. The dribble wheel of life, running for some pellets. So, yeah, I mean, I often think like, what is a life well lived? What does that mean? And, I mean, we have our necessities that we need to take care of. We need food, we need shelter, we need, lots of things like that, which jobs provide us with. But, there's something more out there for us, and like you said, we have lineages and, I believe I was put here probably for a reason more than just to turn a nickel. And so, what is that? What is that purpose? And so, um, you guys want to get freaky? I know I don't actually know the answer to that question, so but I know that there needs to be greater meaning in life than than just showing up for work and exchanging labor for. Well, we talk about this actually. So, um, what is it called? Hertzberg's hygiene versus motivational theories, right?
Oh yeah.
There's things that people show up for work for, like pay and health insurance and job security, and if those things are decreased, then you're bummed as an employee. And then there's reasons people show up for work, like a chance at promotion, and you like your colleagues,
Yeah.
and you learn things, and there's things that get you excited to show up for work, and those are motivational factors to show up for work. So I think poor managers and leaders and poor organizations really just look at that exchange like money for labor.
Yeah.
I'll give
Very
you
transactional.
health, and yeah, exactly, transactional versus like how do you fully develop create a place where people can really fully develop as humans, and as a result they're going to give more to your organization. They're going to share that knowledge. They're going to be willing to be vulnerable, open up, be creative like you and I are. Even if we're like, oh, this might sound stupid, but because it's going to lead us to a better, more creative place where that's everybody's like ingenuity. Well, that's how you get it, by making a place where people can show up with broad perspectives, broad life experiences, a variety of ways of thinking about things, doing things, different than me. And so there's not a box for them to show up packaged in. Instead, it's like, let me, instead of, creating this create a quality environment for you to come to. Um,
Yeah, no, as I was listening to you speak just there, John, a thought occurred to me, which is that something that is often unacknowledged in our culture and society is that work is a place where we not only make meaning, but process meaning. We often think that work is a place where we generate products and services, which is true. However, if we can't align that deep need to understand and to make meaning, then well, we don't end up making very much, right? And so it's this is really why I see the value in understanding that knowledge, communication, and relationships are our core equity opportunities, because without understanding, then we can't really understand why people need different things,
Right.
right? It leads us to the much easier cognitively way of thinking about things of equality, right? But it is this kind of the paradigm of equality that did get us to this point. We can't ignore that. It's just that we are really finding that equality is not always enough. And it is surprising to me that there is so much pushback against this, right? So, very few people have problems with accessibility options for people to get into buildings, like a wheelchair ramp, right? That doesn't harm us. um, Very few people have objections against things like warnings for allergies, because people, especially children, are very vulnerable and they could die. And so those are expressions of equity, not equality. And so it is very confusing right now. And I think a lot of people are messed up over this, is like, well, yeah, how far does this have to go? And I think that's also a thing that we have to come to an agreement on, not only in the workplace, but in society as well. I think also what I'm seeing is there are many organizations that are recognizing this, especially in the statements of support that they're lending to racial and social justice movements. But there are many people who are noting that these claims or these expressions of solidarity ring somewhat hollow,
Mhm.
because beyond that, it's business as usual.
Right.
And a lot of workers are still sitting there kind of thinking, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah, I agree. I think the so for some reason somebody has associated equity with one must lose if another is to win, right? And
Scarcity
equality,
mindset.
equality, we all get to win, right? What did you call it?
Scarcity mindset, right?
Scarcity mindset, exactly, right? Like that, like as if I don't get to walk up the stairs if we put a ramp in for someone who is in a wheelchair, right? Like, well, now I have to go up the ramp, and like we don't question those things, or if they're like, there's something in here that could give you an anaphylactic reaction and you might die, right? I'm like, well, what if I don't? Like, then eat it. Like I don't lose out. I don't lose out because there's a warning label on there. I mean, I guess I could if I don't understand that, electrical shocks could kill me then. Um, but I think that you're right that a lot of people have put out these grand statements of support, but they don't understand exactly what that means in real life practice, And so, and it would get back to this, what I would call, you and I have talked about this book, Reframing Organizations by Bowman and Deal, this symbolic frame, right? And we
Mm.
talked about trust earlier. When you're an organization that says, we're going to do something about this, and then you don't do it, right? Then you are seen as the translated messages, we don't mean what we say, which devalues trust. And then people stop showing up, like giving you all they got, because they're like, well, why would I? You said you do this for me and you didn't. And so it's a really demoralizing thing, because our default, I think, is to go toward those white supremacy culture things, not to be confused with white supremacy, by the way. You can Google white supremacy culture, lots of articles out there. But it's things that make us be have a scarcity mindset, compete against one another. And so our default when we say equity is to go back to what we know, which is not equitable, it's equal. uh,
Hmm.
you know
And it is worth noting that many of the social problems that we have in the United States today actually do originate with that framing of profit over people,
mhm.
right? That's what slavery is about. That's what broken treaties are about. That's what a lot of things are about. And yeah, I mean, It's true. We are all used to living in this way, but I think we're coming to a point where, again, we are confronted with the question, when is enough enough?
Mm,
So I think there's a lot of hope. There is a lot of optimism, but on the other side, I see many arguments dismissing people as naive or, say, destabilizing democracy. But well, to take that example of destabilizing democracy, if we can't people that agree to see issues in a common fashion, then they are not debatable. And if they're not debatable, then what is our process for making decisions? Because that is at the heart of the democratic process.
mm,
So, yeah, I know that we've kind of colored outside of the lines of the work experience, but organizations are embedded in communities, and communities now are not always tied to geography, right? So, our
mm.
own team is an example. I live in California. John, you are in New Hampshire. We've got teammates in Colorado, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and yeah, of course, the Boston area as well. But if we can't be kind of pulling in our experiences as individuals from our own communities into our organization, then that disconnect will certainly be felt.
Yeah.
And it's really when we don't build those opportunities to strengthen, reevaluate, meditate on, even reflect on, certainly knowledge, communication, and relationships, then, and when we revert to that business as usual thing, that so much just gets swept under the rug.
Yeah. I agree. I think the great thing about, well, one of if you're trying to find some golden lining to this pandemic, doing virtual work has really upended structures that used to be in place that really made certain things difficult, right? That reinforce those oppressive systems. You know, how we do work with one another, how we're in community with one another has changed. I'm able to attend to things I didn't get to attend to when I was in an office for 8 hours. So it's really changed our world in some ways, and I think we should take advantage of that. And the other thing I want to leave you all with, and we talk about this in our workshops, is that one of the great things about communication, relationships as core equity opportunities is, you know, a lot of people think, well, I have to be a leader if I'm going to change, you know,
Yeah.
the values. I need to be a leader if I'm going to change the strategic plan. I need to be a leader if I'm going to decide who gets to get hired. Knowledge, relationships, and communication are things we all have. We all have that. So feel empowered by that. And you should also know those are positional leaders. You are what I would call an expressive leader, or you can have a person who has great weight and value amongst your peers, and you are a leader. And so, you know, if you're able to leverage how you communicate, who you communicate with, what you communicate with, you share your knowledge with certain people, spread that around, you know, and use your social capital to build relationships. You know, you are being far more of a leader than anyone with a title. And so those are core equity opportunities because everybody's got them and everybody can use them, regardless of where you sit in the structure of your organization.
Absolutely. Um, that was a great breakdown, John. And I wonder, before we go, if in our last kind of couple minutes here, you could talk a little bit about what you would love to see come out of your work. And by your work, I really mean that in the broadest sense, right? So we talk a lot about who we're developing into as human beings, kind of the intentionality about fostering some parts of who we are and maybe not so much to others. So I'm just curious to know, in that whole process, like, what are some outcomes that you would love to see?
Yeah. So I want people to know that we can all prosper, right? We can all be who we are meant to be. And for me, what equity is not about raising, it's not just about raising the floor so other people, you know, have more level ground to stand on, but it's really about how do we pull the top off of each of our potential so that we can grow to whatever that may be. So to me, inclusive organizations, inclusive relationships are about seeing the potential in one another and helping each other grow, and moving the limits of that so that we can really expand beyond, rather than just like what's the bottom that we need to raise up. So if I could do anything, it would be not just to right the wrongs, but how do you really make it expansive so people can really grow to their full potential in this world. And I think that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that because often we pay attention to the problems and what's not going right. And then once we get into dealing with those things, we can start to see the other side. And often what's scary about that is we don't have a plan, we don't have a vision because we've been dealing with the problem for so long.
Right.
So, keep talking to one another, keep building your knowledge, your skills around communication, and your relationships. And, hopefully we'll be back with you soon. Thank you all so, so much for your time today. Before we go, I do want to mention that on November 5th, we've got another dignity activity going live. Thank you so much, Miles. And if you're wondering more about the experience that people have been having in the dignity activity, well, we've got several people who have had very kind words for us to say. But one of our participants, not this last time, but the time before, mentioned that this workshop came at a critical moment in my leadership journey. I have clear next steps on how to take responsibility over my growth. So if that's not a glowing endorsement, I don't know what is. Anyway, till next time, my name is Enrico E. Manalo, Chief of Learning Success at All Aces Inc., if I could say my title correctly. And I was joined today by my very good friend and colleague, John Monaghan III, Director of Partnerships, also at All Aces. Until next time, everybody.